and gentlemen, please welcome our 38 delegates from around the world in their national costumes for the Mrs. Universe 2014 World Finals. Ladies and gentlemen, let's get to meet each and every one of our international delegates tonight, beginning with Mrs. Australasia, Kim Kinsella.
Mrs. Australia, Francesca Macmillan.
Mrs. Belarus, Natalia Trafimova.
Mrs. Belgium, Christel Verhelst.
Let's say hello to Mrs. Brazil, Patricia Scheibe.
Mrs. Cambodia, Sapo Rendal.
Please welcome Mrs. Canary Islands, Miriam Cruz.
And say ni hao to Mrs. China, Bing Yujiang.
Here's Mrs. England, Sandhya Oza.
Mrs. Guatemala, Jamie Perez.
Mrs. Hong Kong, Ling Fangzhang.
Mrs. India, Ashleen Chand.
Mrs. Italy, Carmen Rosa Dionisio.
Mrs. Japan, Yoshimi Ishiyama.
Mrs. Latina USA, Gina Marcela Garcia.
Mrs. Latvia, Anita Puzzole.
Mrs. Malaysia, Sua Ang.
Mrs. Mauritius, Silvana Jean-Charles.
Here's Mrs. Mexico, Eugenia Navarro.
Say namaste to Mrs. Nepal, Rajani Thapa.
Please say hello to Mrs. Netherlands, Angelica Smeding.
Welcome Mrs. New Zealand, Merciana Suis.
Ladies and gentlemen, say hello to Mrs. Nicaragua, Alicia Cabrera.
Mrs. North America, Teresa Scanlon.
Mrs. Pakistan, Mariam Muhammad.
Mrs. Philippines, Hemelin Escudero Tamayo.
Here's Mrs. Poland, Anastasia Ayazawa.
And we say hello to Mrs. Russia, Ekaterina Plotko.
Mrs. Scotland, Nikki Sanghera.
Welcome to Mrs. Siberia, Valentina Chevtaeva.
Mrs. Singapore, Cheryl Ho.
Please welcome Mrs. South Africa, Shanae de Kock.
Let's say hello to Mrs. South Korea, Lee A-ja.
And a big hola to Mrs. Spain, Thais Arias.
Please welcome Mrs. Thailand, Nok Chai Komrong.
Mrs. Ukraine, Anna Soltseva.
Mrs. United Kingdom, Robin Morrison.
And our final delegate, Mrs. USA, Sabrina Pinion.
Ladies and gentlemen, please give it up one time for our lovely delegates from around the world, totaling 38 in all, in their resplendent and spectacular national costumes. Tonight, ladies and gentlemen, in the finals, in the first round of the competition, which is the national costume, we shall be awarding one of the delegates with the prize of the best national costume. And now, ladies and gentlemen,
to present that award, We're very glad to welcome Dato' Ngiao Vunyan, the Managing Director for Property Investment Division, Sunway Group.
Ladies and gentlemen, the Best National Costume Award goes to Mrs. Nicaragua.
Alicia Cabrera Arevalo. And you know, since I can't imagine how she packed that costume, it's just as well that she won the prize. Amazing. Beautiful costumes, all the beautiful delegates wore tonight. Thank you very much, Dato' Ngiao Vunyan, and congratulations to Mrs. Nicaragua, Alicia Cabrera Arevalo.
That's all for our congratulations to Mrs. Nicaragua once again. And ladies and gentlemen, all our 38 delegates will now move backstage to prepare for the next round of the competition. Thank you, ladies, and good luck.